Imagine you just gave birth to a child in Afghanistan. If this child is a boy, you will have to send him to a madrasa where he will be taught to look down to women, wage war against infidels, and be molded into yet another soldier of the Taliban. And if this child is a girl, she'll be forced under a veil by the time she turns 6 or 9, banned from going to school, disappearing into invisibility, a ghost. An unexisting species, unable to speak outside the house, unable to leave the house on her own, and if that's not enough of a prison, she'll be forced into marriage with someone she didn't choose. But if you want to give your child a chance at a different future, one that isn't bleak and brutal, well, then you will have to risk everything and illegally find your way to Europe because doors to legal escape have been slammed shut. You will have to walk across mountains, hoping not to be raped. You will have to swim the Mediterranean, hoping not to drown, make it through an exhausting asylum process, only to face so-called Christian political groups threatening to send you back to Afghanistan because for domestic reasons, they prefer to declare the hell of Afghanistan a safe place. Dear colleagues, all those who supported the intervention to Afghanistan should feel at least a minimum amount of responsibility for the disaster Afghans are facing today. We tried, we failed, we turned our back. This is no option. And I know no one has a master plan on what to do, but there are always steps we can take. Strengthen mechanisms that hold perpetrators of human rights violations accountable. Increase humanitarian aid and make sure it reaches men and women. Work towards the codification of gender apartheid as a crime against humanity. Restart visa and resettlement programs for those most at risk in Afghanistan and the neighboring countries. And we should never, ever make ourselves complicit in the Taliban strategy to silence women. Every day, we have to make an extra effort to hear the voices of Afghan women, to seek their advice, to give them a platform, to ensure their meaningful participation and representation in international fora negotiations. For that boys and girls born in Afghanistan tomorrow may have a brighter future. And one word to those on my right who don't care about human rights. Let me remind you of the main lesson Taliban have taught us in the past years. Radicalization happening in Afghanistan won't stay in Afghanistan, no matter how high you build your walls.
Thank you, President. Gender apartheid. This is what is taking place in Afghanistan. The Taliban took power 3 years ago. Since then, women have been overrun by a spiral of violence, denial of their freedoms and rights. Their voice has been snuffed out from the Afghan society. I should like to call on this House to think. What would you do if your daughter, your sister, your partner, or if you yourself were banned from existing? You couldn't leave your house by yourself, not speak in public, show your face, study, or work? It would mean, simply, that your existence would be cancelled. The European Union cannot allow these women to be forgotten. 3 years have gone by now, and the situation is only getting worse. We are indebted to the Afghan people who supported the international coalition and are trapped in their country. For those activists, for those journalists, we must guarantee them humanitarian visas. The country has been destroyed by hunger, by poverty, and women must be involved. They are not just victims, but they can also be drivers of change. That is why we cannot accept that they be banned from the negotiation table. And that is precisely what is happening, unfortunately. This apartheid that is damaging women and girls has not been recognized internationally, and it limits then the tools that we have against the Taliban. The EU must wage this war. This gender apartheid must be recognized as a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Señora Moretti.
Thank you, Ms. Moretti. The floor now goes to Mr. Austrovicius for 1.5 minutes as author of the resolution.
Mr. Chair, Madam Commissioner, dear colleagues, the Taliban's systematic and consistent decisions to turn Afghanistan into a radical Sharia territory must be met with a strong response from the civilized world. There is no alternative. Afghan women and girls have become the main target of discrimination and exclusion from public life. They are being excluded from social life, progress, and opportunities for participation in decision-making. This violates their political and social rights and robs the country of its future potential. We must do everything possible to ensure that gender apartheid is recognized as a crime against humanity. I call on the European Union to take all possible action in this area. There can be no decisions on Afghanistan without the participation of Afghan women. We must maintain the policy of non-recognition of the Taliban and prevent this regime from becoming an international partner and a dictator on social regression. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Now the floor would go to Ms. Neumann for 2.5 minutes as author of the resolution.
Muchas gracias, señora Newman.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Sara Sanchez for 2.5 minutes as an author.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to do is address the Afghan women who came to this parliament to be heard. Thank you for your sharing your voices and for your courage, and thanks for your fight. We are with you. Afghanistan has become the most dangerous country in the world for women. Women aren't allowed onto the streets without a male guardian. Their voices can't be heard. They have no control over their bodies. They're not able to open windows. They're not able to do sport. And there were also, beauty parlors as well, where they were able to speak to other women before. They can't do that anymore. Now there is a gender apartheid, which is suffocating the public space and which is killing women. They are denying women's right to live, and this is the most aggressive regime in the whole world. But it wasn't always the case. Afghan women have always been a point of reference for women. If you look at the achievements, the feminist achievements they made from the 1920s and the 1960s, and the right to education as a fundamental pillar of equal rights. But there's a huge amount of political violence and fundamentalist violence against women across the world who are promoting feminism and fighting for feminism. Now, often people say they are worried about Afghanistan, but they don't care about women in Afghanistan. They don't care about women's rights across the world. One more thing. We need to dare to tell the whole story and the damage that has been caused by interventions from NATO and the United States for geopolitical reasons. These are illegal wars, funding terrorist groups. These created a failed state, and which has allowed the progression of the Taliban. We need to learn from history. War is never the solution. War destroys everything. And to conclude, now I'd like to ask how, given this situation, member states of the European Union continue to refuse international protection for Afghan women, for minorities, for families who are fleeing the Taliban regime. You need to act firmly. You need to stop being complicit, and you need to protect women's lives. Afghan women are not alone, and the European institutions need to show this.
Muchísimas gracias, señora Serra. Ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Ms. Serra. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Vrechenova for 1.5 minutes as author of the resolution.
Vážené kolegyně.
Colleagues,
The situation of women in Afghanistan is critical. The country is run by Islamic fundamentalists, the Taliban, who are making women's lives worse day by day and trampling on universal human rights. If the EU takes its values seriously, it must find a resolute solution to this problem. There have to be comprehensive sanctions against the Taliban leadership, and they must be brought before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And unfortunately, it's not just Afghanistan. There is also Iran and women's fight for their rights there. We've just had the anniversary of Mahsa Amini's murder by the regime in Iran. This is the personification of what is happening in Afghanistan and Iran.
Ahora tiene la palabra
Thank you very much. Ms. Estaras, on behalf of the EPP.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Since the Taliban took control, we've seen an institutionalization of persecution and repression of women. This is a crisis against humanity on a daily basis. There are breaches of human rights and crimes which breach international law with complete impunity. 21 million Afghan women have seen their country turn into a hell, and many of them prefer to die rather than fall into the hands of the Taliban. It's been said here they're banned from education, excluded from the labour market. They're not able to travel without being accompanied by male. They're covered from head to toe, not able to wear heels or do sport or go to beauty parlours. They're not able to use mobile phones with cameras. They're not able to use public transport, raise their voices, play music, etc. And the punishments are atrocious: rapes, executions, flogging, stoning. And the justice system is not independent whatsoever. For this reason, they want us to talk about them and not forget them. We need to raise awareness globally, and we need to take action. We need to raise our voices because we cannot allow them to remain alone. We need to support them. They all came yesterday and today to see us, and these are the face of the revolution, and Europe needs to be up to the job and promote the rights of Afghan women. Thank you.
Gracias, señora Estaras. Ahora tiene la
Thank you, Ms. Estaras. Ms. Jalul Muro, on behalf of the S&D Group, for 2 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, honourable members. Now, I have a concern as a defender of human rights, what we should all be. Now, the law on the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice is another blow to the rights of Afghan women and girls, and this legislation restricts their movement, what clothes they wear and what they do in public, and it's part of a patriarchal system and violence which relegates them to the shadows. And since the Taliban took over in 2021, we've seen a systematic breach of women's rights against all international law and human rights standards. We need to commit to combat violence against women and girls. We cannot stay in the sidelines. We need to fight this because millions of people are seeing their lives repressed. The response has not been sufficient. We believe that we need to create a strategy with stakeholders in the region involving member states so that asylum claims from Afghan women can be managed. We also need to support civil society organizations in Afghanistan and support the work there because there is a gender apartheid happening there, and we should consider this as a crime against humanity. We also need to allow women to be connected, to have emotional shelter and right to education. Those who want to fuel a narrative of hate should not do so. This is not about Islam. Islam is being manipulated to put these women under the Taliban's control. We should not forget that the rights of women are human rights. The European Union needs to be a decisive actor and not a passive actor. And I'd like to focus on what Ms. Serra said. No, we need to carry on fighting. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jalloul. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Sardone on behalf of the Patriots for Europe for 2.5 minutes. I wonder where the feminists are when we talk about the rights of women in Islamic countries. They lose their ability to speak. We don't hear them. We haven't seen a single individual from the left that used the term Islamic. Now, what is happening in Afghanistan, it makes me shudder, and I say that as a woman, first and foremost, as a free woman. We've seen the rights of these women that are denied in this Islamic country: crimes, persecution, torture, detention. Girls and women are subjected to this in Afghanistan by the Taliban. It's the lowest point ever. And have you read recently the laws against women? They cannot go out in the street by themselves. They cannot dress as they should like. They cannot go to school. They must cover every part of their body. They cannot look directly at a man who is not a relative. We cannot hear their voice in public, singing or speaking. The only thing that they can do is just be a woman, and because they're women, they cannot do these things. Now, usually the left likes to talk about the patriarchy, but when it comes to radical Islam, they don't speak. And what we see is that they do not have words for this type of harassment, gender harassment. Perhaps it is too tiring. Perhaps it is too uncomfortable to speak up for those in Kabul, where we have Taliban, burqa, Sharia, blows, where they are subjected, and there is no indignation there. No one is taking to the street. What we have seen is that in Europe and Afghanistan, there is a certain amount of tolerance towards this type of culture that is not at all compatible with our principles of democracy and freedom. You have shown that when you have an Islamic headscarf in official European Commission communication, all of this with the consequences that we have seen. We've seen our cities are full of women with headscarves and even with burqas, in little girls in schools, as it turns out. All of this oppression, because of religious reasons, is unacceptable, and we will continue to speak up out against it, even if we are threatened with death. I will continue to speak out against this. Europe must do its part and cannot turn a blind eye. Thank you.
Palabra al señor.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Mantovani for 1 minute on behalf of the ECR group.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. All of us here in this chamber are stating that this is in civil law. It is from a barbaric culture, and we are justifiably condemning it. But saying this is not enough. We need an immediate change to European policies towards the Taliban. Along with the Fratelli d'Italia delegation, I presented a question to the Commission to have a stock-taking of policies towards Afghanistan, and the 150 million euros that were earmarked to Afghanistan for humanitarian aid, and one of the aspects of that was the freedom of women, the empowerment of women. Apparently, this does not work. We need tangible policy to assist women in Afghanistan, protection and asylum for all of those women who are able somehow to flee from this regime that would like to study or work in Europe. Let us acknowledge immediately the right to be refugees here, the statute of refugee. These are true refugees. Europe is a leader of principle of justice and freedom, and we defend freedom and justice. Thank you.
Ahora tendría la palabra la señora.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Agrigotia on behalf of Renew for a minute and a half.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos.
Good evening, everybody. Now, there was no doubt that we needed to present a resolution on the rights of women in Afghanistan on the 21st of August, just a few days after being in power for 3 years, enacted a law which is a form of social repression. What this law does is bans women's voices from being heard in public spaces, and it stops their faces from being seen in the streets. A document with 35 articles which covers a series of draconian laws, and it deems that women's voices are a potential form of vice, and they're not, and we cannot they're not able to have their voices heard outside of their own homes. Women in the 1970s in Afghanistan used to go to university. Now they're not able to be in the street. And this is why I ask this Parliament, as it's done previously in other situations, to set out a clear position on this alarming situation that is violating the rights of women in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra el señor.
Thank you very much. Mr. Satouri, on behalf of the Green Group. For 2 minutes, please.
Dans notre hémicycle, ce temple de la...
Yesterday, in this chamber, we heard from Afghan women. They standing up to their regime, they are trying to communicate with the international community. They call upon us not to forget them. They call upon us to act. They warn us to stop the extremists and hate. They don't want international law to collapse. We have a collective responsibility to protect their dignity. That means no communication with the Taliban. We need to ensure they call upon us to protect them, to receive them. At this very moment, there are thousands of women suffering in Afghanistan. There are Afghan women being persecuted in neighboring Iran. It is our duty to receive and protect them here. We have to do our part in granting international protection and asylum to these women.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Morace on behalf of the Left Group for a minute and a half.
Grazie. Presidente, lo scorso 21...
Thank you, President. In August, the law entered into force in Afghanistan in protection of virtue and prevention of vice. So we need to understand what virtue and vice is for a woman. It makes me shudder. The Taliban are going back to the darkest period of our humanity. It is much worse than medieval. Now, the Afghan women that have been here in the European Parliament, and any of them that are perhaps listening to this debate in hiding, thanks to a connection, I would like to just state to them, do not lose hope. Believe in a world that is different, in a place where you are free to be the people that you want to be. And look at who you want to be, eat what you want to eat, dress as you want to dress, listen to music. In Europe, we knew dark times too. And in Europe, under different aspects, there are those who would like to limit our freedom and that would like to shift to ideology and the power of men. But we women, we are stronger, we are united, and we will not succumb. President, in Afghanistan, what we can see is that there is a ferocious war against women and their rights. For this reason, we are calling for a diplomatic intervention to make their rights at the very heart of the future of our policies. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Fröhlich for 2 minutes on behalf of the ESN group.
Herr Präsident, Kinderehen.
President, forced marriage for children, 800 gang rapes over the last year. We've seen many knife attacks. We've also seen FGM. These are not figures and facts from Afghanistan, but from Germany. And we can see we do not want to bring Kabul to Europe. We want to have the deportation of Afghans. Therefore, we need to have pragmatic relations with the Taliban and not arrogant lectures. This is what people in the West haven't understood. We don't have to like the Taliban. I don't like the Taliban. I don't like this new law either. But these are those in control in the country in which all this is happening. We've had Sovietization, democratization. None of those things have worked. It is often called the cemetery of the empires, and then when it comes to the pride flag, for example, the Western imperialism has failed, and after this 3 years after this failure, it's not our job to lecture the Taliban. Leave this to their neighbors, Iran and China. These have been critical about the situation of women in Afghanistan. All of them are calling on an end on the restrictions and the continuation of women's education. They know the region better than we do. Kabul depends on good relations with Beijing and Tehran. Brussels and Berlin must not become Kabul. Our interest is to deport, deport, and deport with diplomacy rather than just silly words. Thank you.
pasaría la palabra a la señora.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Terlak for 1 minute, please.
Chair, Commissioner, colleagues, since the Taliban regained power again in Afghanistan, life has reduced to work and mosque for men and to family for women. Without a doubt, under the Taliban, every Afghani lost, but Afghani women really lost everything. They lost their right to work, they lost their right to education, they lost their right to choose their own identity or to choose to marry and whom they want to marry. And now their loss is complete. They're losing their voice as well. With our military withdrawal, we seem to start to look away, where other powers as China and Russia now operate in the power vacuum that has risen. And it's positive that Europe has reopened its diplomatic post. Hopefully, that's a small step to hear the Afghan women and to support the women and men who are courageous in Afghanistan to stand up against the Taliban. We must not forget all the women and children who are living oppressed without control over their own bodies. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Temido for 2 minutes. President, Commissioner, classifying this debate as an urgency is not just a procedural question. It is urgent to speak out against the gender apartheid in Afghanistan, as it is urgent for us to do everything we can to protect women in the country. The Taliban have been in power now for 3 years. Since then, women can no longer go to school. They cannot go to university, they can't work, they cannot carry out any athletic activities, they cannot travel far from their home. And at the end of the last month, in August, these limitations were transformed into the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice law, meaning that they are interpreting a Sharia law, and they cannot speak, they cannot recite the Quran in public, many other things. Now, this is a part of a context in which there is a severe economic crisis. Women cannot leave the house. They cannot be a part of any learning process. 90% of Afghan girls do not even have their basic needs met. They are completely isolated, subjected, and they are showing grave signs of depression. And what we can see is that this is a humanitarian crisis. We cannot abandon these women to the mercy of a brutal regime. We demand for the withdrawal of the virtue and vice law. We can now allow the Taliban to use women as a commodity, and in all countries, in the darkness and in shadows and in silence, the Afghan women continue to exist. And we need them to know that we are there and we will support them in their shadows and in their silence. Thank you.
Señora Temido, ahora tiene la...
Thank you, Ms. Temido. Ms. Androuet, for 2 minutes, please.
L'adoption de la loi sur la promotion de la vertu.
The adoption of the law on the promotion of virtue and the punishment of vice has led to women being locked up and under constant surveillance. They're not allowed to move around freely. They don't have access to education. They cannot work where they choose. However, unanimous condemnation isn't going to change anything. Moral support is all well and good, but actual support is better. Afghanistan's exiled women don't think that Europe is up to the task. An Afghan athlete who has complained about the new legislation has faced death threats. She's been in Paris for 2 years, and she didn't think that her life would be under threat in Paris. She received calls from Afghanistan, France, Belgium, Germany. She now feels afraid at the heart of Europe. There is a culture war against us in Europe. Our political institutions are weak, and this is leading us to drop our vigilance. We should relegate political correctness to the dustbin. Unfortunately, the left is cowardly. We should be protecting our culture, protecting our women, our mothers, sisters, and daughters.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la...
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Loiseau for 1.5 minutes.
Colleagues, the Olympic and Paralympic Games have just finished. I'd just like to talk to you about Zaku Aliadi. She was born disabled, but she is now a bronze medal in Taekwondo with the refugee camp. And many people in this hemicycle do not want to welcome these people to Europe. She is fantastic, extraordinary, and I'm very proud of what my country did for her. I'd also like to talk about Masia Hemidi. She was also a refugee in France, and she's also a Taekwondo champion. And she launched a campaign on social media to denounce gender apartheid and what's happening in Afghanistan. And there are also calls, there are also insults being hurled at her from various countries, and this is shameful. We need to continue fighting for Afghan women, and I'm ashamed of the indifference of so-called self-proclaimed feminists. And I'm ashamed of all of those people who talked about a moderate Taliban returning to Kabul. I'm ashamed of those who have links with the Taliban government. We need to defend Afghan women, and this is what we need to focus on. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Loiseau. Ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. The floor now goes to Ms. Toussaint for 2 minutes.
Chers collègues,
Colleagues, I should like to invite you to close your eyes and imagine just for a few seconds' time. Imagine if you could not speak, sing, yell, or even speak in the streets, or even at home. Imagine if you were not allowed to move about freely, go to the doctor, to the park, to school. Just imagine for a second. Now, this is the lot of Afghan women. They are fully isolated. We want to silence them, to erase them. Kabul fell 3 years ago to the Taliban, and the situation of women has only gotten worse, to full erasure. Women, however, continue to resist. They are a source of hope. They are a source of an invitation to listen to their silenced voices. Mr. Sartori and I, we have friends from Afghanistan here this week. Metsola even congratulated them. They have been with us all week. These women are diplomats. They are citizens. They are all working together to defend peace and justice in Afghanistan. One of them, Ibrahim Mahal, was held in custody and tortured by the regime because she stood up to them. All of these women have fled their country to continue to fight for the rights of all, whether they be men or women. We cannot allow their voices to be silenced. Allowing women to be snuffed out in a certain place in the world would be tantamount to doing it across the board. And in fact, that is the words of some that were with us this week said that we continue to show solidarity with Afghan women. It is not a combat for them, but for all of humanity. We must continue to stand with them. We cannot make it banal for this gender apartheid to continue. It must be considered a crime against humanity. And yes, we should welcome these individuals, both men and women. We have seen that sometimes the case is the same in neighboring countries, in Pakistan and elsewhere. Only if Europe can do this will it actually be worthy of its values.
Señora.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Demirel for 1.5 minutes.
Dankeschön, Herr Präsident.
Thank you, Mr. President. Women's rights are a barometer for the state of a society. This, according to German Foreign Minister Baerbock. The feminist foreign policy is mixed with pragmatism. How pragmatic? You can see in the border controls going up and the deportations to Afghanistan, where 23 million people are hungry. It's the only country where children can only go to school for 6 years, where women have to cover themselves completely, where they have no right to health care. NATO bombed Afghanistan for 20 years. That was their way of fighting for women's rights and against the Taliban. And now they're negotiating with the same Taliban over deportations. Yes, women's rights are a barometer for the state of a society, but women's rights are also a political football. We will not accept that. Women should be free wherever they live and enjoy solidarity and human rights. Thank you.
I'm sorry, you have a blue card. Ms. Demirel, you have a blue card.
It will be from Sardone.
I need translation, wait.
Okay.
Faccio a lei una domanda che vorrei...
I'd like to put a question to you like I would to all of those on the left. Is there a reason why you, in all of your speeches, you never use the word Islam or radical Islam in any of your speeches? I don't understand the apartheid that the women are suffering and Islam, radical Islam. If you don't see that link, you can't see the problem. I have to be honest, it really makes me sad.
Dankeschön, liebe Kollegen.
Thank you for the supplementary question. Given where I come from, it's a bit laughable. I have Kurdish roots. I come from Turkey. I'm from a religious minority, and I'm here fighting for democracy and freedom. And I know that in the Middle East, there are many people fighting for democracy and freedom. The bitter truth, though, is that there are countries in Europe that have meddled in the Middle East over the years. Forces like Al-Qaeda were actually helped by the United States in their fight with the Soviet Union. The left always fight for democracy and freedom. The Islamists are not my spiritual brothers, they're yours.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The floor now goes to Ms. Melletti for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. My dear colleagues, I have just 1 minute to speak about the women's rights in Afghanistan. So I have 1 minute to speak about something that just does not exist. Women in Afghanistan have no fundamental rights anymore. The Taliban and their abusive laws have made sure that they are crushed to the extreme, aiming to make them lead a life with no existence. Have you ever wondered the strength, this patience, the courage it requires being a woman in Afghanistan? The fear, the pain, the unfairness, the terror, punishment, even death that this entails. What is happening in Afghanistan today is not just a gender apartheid, it's a real crime against humanity, a shame to the world. And as long as Taliban try to degrade women, to make them, to take the life from women.
Thank you. The next speaker is Ms.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. 1 minute of silence is usually a way of showing sympathy with pain, mourning, collective respect when somebody dies or when there's been a disaster or when there's an accident or a murder. And we tend to do this before football matches or in public squares or in parliaments like this one. And these collective silences in public spaces are done to show respect for people and our fundamental values. However, in Afghanistan, they have passed a law on promotion of virtue and prevention of vice, and with this they want to impose a very different type of silence, a type of silence which terrorizes women and girls, which deletes them basically because the mere fact that they're women and girls, they're not even allowing their voices to be heard, and they're not allowed to show their face either. Showing our face is the way we identify ourselves and we show people who we are. We're all unique. In Europe, we cannot remain silent. We need to raise our voices so that they are able to recover theirs. No, it's intolerable and we should be ashamed of what is happening there. Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Gisin for 2 minutes.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Greetings to the colleagues. In 2021, Islamic fundamentalists took control of Afghanistan. And from that time, they took away from all women and girls any human dignity. This persecution has reached unacceptable levels. In August, a new law has come into force where women can no longer sing, speak out loud in public, and they must cover their face and their body completely. They are fully subjected. This is scandalous and unacceptable. The Western world, including our institutions, has a duty to act and to speak. To date, very little has been done. Denying the existence of the real problems of fundamental Islam annuls the dignity of women. That is why I wrote to President Metsola, such that the European Parliament will fight for these persecuted women and girls, but for all women and girls that are constrained by fundamental Islam and subjected, even those that live in our countries. We must take a clear position. This type of barbaric action runs counter, and we have seen Sharia law, even in Europe, is giving the rules to the Islamic families here in Europe, even within and outside of the household, because they are supposed to choose, but we should cry. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. McNamara for 1.5 minutes.
This August, colleagues, 3 years after the fall of Kabul, the Taliban promulgated a new law, Article 22.10 of which stated, an enforcer is duty-bound to prevent the following individual wrongful acts: the sound of a woman's voice or any music emanating from any gathering or from the home. I think one of the saddest aspects of this is that it was entirely predictable that this is what the Taliban would do. Yet it begs a lot of questions as to how the Taliban were able to come to power, how they were able to sweep across the country and into Kabul with such little resistance from the civilian population or indeed the army. How the population were so sickened by the regime which had preceded it that they were almost resigned to their fate to the Taliban. And yet that was a regime which enjoyed huge financial support from the European Union. Afghanistan was one of the biggest beneficiaries of EU development aid. By 2021, 11 billion euros of taxpayers' money had been spent, exceeding even the amount of money being spent by the United States on the reconstruction effort. It appears that there was very little concern by the donors as to where exactly that money was going and who it was propping up and the degree of support that they had from the civilian population. Yet the answer is not to reduce funding, because we know that by reducing funding, infant mortality will rise again. Maternal mortality, which had been halved in the preceding years, will increase again, and women will die giving birth to a new generation of Afghans. The answer is simply not to stop funding. It is to take responsibility for who we fund and how. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor now to Ms. Schilling for 1.5 minutes.
Dear colleagues, yesterday we welcomed very brave Afghan women to the European Parliament. Women who stand up for their rights and for all women and girls in Afghanistan every day, risking their lives and facing terrible repercussion. The situation for women and girls in Afghanistan has dramatically worsened over the past months and years once more. Not allowed to speak or show their face outside their home. Not allowed to get education, threatened and harassed. We cannot even imagine what it must be like to be virtually erased from public life. Try to do that. Try to think about getting your rights just disappeared. It is imperative to expand EU restrictive measures against those who are responsible for terrible human rights violations. We need to fight with them and not just speak about that, to get their fundamental rights back. Rights that never should have been taken away from them in the first place. One way to do this is to increase the support of Afghan civil society groups that are working on the ground for women and girls' rights. Human rights defenders and minorities, we have to stand with them, now and always. The well-being of Afghan women and girls has to be a priority, not just now, but always. Women's rights cannot be up for discussion, neither inside or outside the EU. Everyone who believes in fundamental rights, in women's rights, need to stand up and raise their voice every day.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Barrena for 1 minute.
Thanks, Mr. President, Commissioner, colleagues, dear colleagues. Afghanistan is currently facing multiple overlapping crises: economic, humanitarian, climate, and political, each of which is interconnected and exacerbated by the growing women's rights crisis. Over the past 2 years, the Taliban have imposed increasingly abusive policies, particularly against the women and girls and religious and ethnic minorities that clearly violate Afghanistan's obligations under international human rights law. The situation in Afghanistan demands women-led, gender-centered and evidence-based approach. The European Union must up its humanitarian efforts and ensure that our aid programs across the country fight sources of social inequalities and prioritize aid to victims of human rights and gender-based violence. I would like to call on the European Union member states to establish and facilitate safe and legal pathways for Afghans at risk, including by increasing resettlement quotas, humanitarian visas, and easing family reunification, particularly for women and girls. The women of Afghanistan need us, and our voice must be used to amplify theirs. Thanks so much.
Muchas gracias, señor Barrena.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barrena. The next speaker is Mr. Kelly for 1 minute.
The systemic erosion of women's rights in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime is a grave and pressing issue that deserves greater attention on the international stage. Recent laws implemented by the Taliban represent another chilling step towards gender apartheid, aimed at erasing women and girls from public life entirely. We must unequivocally condemn the Taliban's radical interpretation of Sharia law, which has led to rampant gender persecution and a culture of fear. Women are not just being denied their rights, they are being systematically oppressed, with access to education and work severely restricted. The resilience of Afghan women is a testament to the human spirit, yet we cannot leave them to face this oppression alone. The international community, including the European Union, must do more and act more decisively. I have been trying for some time to get a family, mainly women, out of Afghanistan, but can't get them visas. We in the EU need to make more visas available for Afghan women in particular. The sooner the better.
Gracias, señor Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. The next speaker is Ms. Inchir for 1 minute.
Colleagues, women in Afghanistan are facing a horrific life under the new law enacted by the Taliban regime. This law imposes horrific restrictions that effectively erase women from public life. Women are mandated to cover themselves entirely, their voices silenced in public spaces. Moreover, they cannot move freely unless accompanied by a male relative. It is men who decide over their bodies and voices, perpetuating a cycle of oppression. This extreme gender oppression is not just a violation of basic human rights. It is an affront to dignity and equality. We must stand firm against this systematic targeting of women and girls, just as we continue supporting the women in Iran and the Jina revolution. We must also rally for Afghan women facing similar oppression. We cannot turn a blind eye to the gender apartheid that seeks to completely strip women of their freedom. I urge the Commission and the Member States to use all the tools available against the regime. Women of Afghanistan are not alone. Let us press for the immediate revocation of this oppressive law. And this is an example of why we need a feminist foreign policy.
Muchas gracias. Ahora
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Mariani for 2 minutes.
Afghanistan, la France.
In Afghanistan, women have ceased to exist. This is the latest development from the Taliban, who have created a hellish landscape. There are 35 articles in this surrealist law, and they've now introduced a new form of craziness. They are making women slaves, and then this is based on their own initiative in the region. For 40 years now, we Europeans have pursued an interventionist agenda based on what the US and the UK have done. And this was started in the 1980s by the CIA. $6 to $12 billion have been given to Islamists via Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And this is what gave rise to the Taliban. And then after 20 years of occupation, who will remember the sums involved? $21 billion distributed since 2021. And these have been transported by the United Nations, as recalled by Le Monde a couple of days ago. Afghan women will remember this, because despite the silence of this new law that this law imposes, we are all responsible for their sad fate. There are many colleagues who have a limited vision of this. I advise you, stop subsidizing the Taliban via EU humanitarian aid. 126 million euros this year. We need to do so to protect women, and we should also, within the European Union, stop funding NGOs such as Femis Law, close to the Muslim Brotherhood, and these are in line with our worst enemies. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Kamara for 1.5 minutes.
Chers collègues, I should like, in this minute and a half, to speak to you about the Afghan medal winner from the refugee team. She left Afghanistan because she had a disability and because she was excellent at Taekwondo. I'd also like to speak to you about a feminist who was kidnapped and tortured by the regime for having been a part of for speaking out against the regime. So now they are here in the parliament, activists. They have fled the patriarchal regime in Afghanistan. Now they are running a campaign against minorities, women. They are oppressed. They've been stripped of their dignity. They have been turned into things. Collectively, we need to fight this gender apartheid. We must take up this issue in international organizations. Gender apartheid must be a crime against humanity. It is an issue that international law and European law must recognize. An entire generation of girls and women are subjected to violence, domination, and institutionalized and systematic oppression. We must act for these women and the minorities around the world, making sure that they have a place here in the EU unconditionally. Yesterday, we applauded these women. I hope this is just the first step in assisting them in their combat. It is time for us to change all of those things that we cannot accept. Thank you.
Gracias. Ahora tendría la palabra.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Rotting for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, als nieuw lid van dit parlement is het een eer om precies op dit onderwerp voor
Thank you, Mr. President. It is an honour to make my maiden speech in the European Parliament on this subject. It is wrong to take women's voice away from them. It is something impossible to imagine. 20 million people disappearing from the streets, young girls not being able to go to school. And I have to reject these ideas that the United States is somehow to blame. Radicalism, whether it's Islamic or other radicalism, is not going to stop at borders. Forced marriages are the reality here too. We have to fight for rights here and in Afghanistan.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Nemec for 1 minute. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, now I would like to spend my 60 seconds talking about women in Afghanistan. These are women who have lost, every second, lose speaking time. They're being erased from public life, but their cries are loud, and our moral duty is to do our utmost to ensure that this nightmare is brought to an end. We need independent investigations within the United Nations. We need a court and humanitarian assistance for women and girls in Afghanistan. This is also essential. We need to condemn this form of apartheid. This is an act against human dignity and human rights. And what's also very important is to raise Europe's voice in Afghanistan. And Veronika Bošković-Pohar, who's the new ambassador in Afghanistan, she's from Slovenia, and I wish her all the best. Thank you. The next speaker is Ms. Teresa Carrión for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente. Thank you very much, President. Ladies and gentlemen and Commissioner, thank you to the Afghan women that are here and that have courageously given us their bore witness to us. Now, what we have seen is that the law in Afghanistan violates the basic rights of humanity, and in this we all agree. I'm sure you agree with me. It is incomprehensible that this chamber is condemning this law and yet allows the import of similar practices in Spain, Germany, and France. We can see women with a niqab frequently. Islamic fundamentalism is what we are denouncing today. Shouldn't we recognize then that this is already starting to attack our freedoms here in Europe? We are speaking out against these practices in Afghanistan. This is a hypocrisy if we don't recognize the same thing here in Europe. These fundamentalist regimes are starting to impose this on our population and making these women follow these rules. Now, in the European Union, we are accomplices if, for political reasons, we allow this fundamental Islam to violate the rights of these people. We must put into practice here in the European institutions similar principle. In fact, what we have seen, there has been an abusive practice of group thought where we cannot be critical of these types of practices. Europe must continue to support its Christian values that inspire the European project to make sure that we are that beacon of hope that the world needs. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Ahora tiene la palabra la señora.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Bayerin for 2 minutes.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, today I won't be speaking in my name. I'll use this minute to give my voice to an Afghan woman who sent me a message from Afghanistan where she is in hiding because she is a threat. My name is Tora Khotak. I was part of the High Court in Afghanistan until the Taliban took over the country. I was forced to cover up once again. My profession and my voice have been taken away from me. The new law which says that women cannot speak in public has silenced us furthermore. We are prisoners in our own country. We are not imprisoned behind walls but behind laws. I'm writing to you with an urgent request for help. We need intervention. We need protection as soon as possible. What we're asking for is the opportunity to be free once again. I call on you, do not leave us alone. For all Afghan women, we listen to you, we will act. We're asking for the European Union to take all possible measures via the instruments that they have to work against these laws and to provide asylum for Afghan women. You are not alone.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Schering-Velgus.
Panie Przewodniczący, koleżanki I koledzy, słuchałam wczoraj
Madam President, dear colleagues, I followed with great interest the debate yesterday on the Committee of Human Rights. Yet again, we listened to terrifying stories from Afghan women. I come from Poland, from Central Europe, where we are also fighting for women's rights, albeit in a different dimension. No matter if we talk about Afghan women, Polish women, Italian women, or women from any other country, I believe that every woman, no matter where he lives, no matter what she does, she should have the right to education, to work, to have a healthy life, and to love. The information that have been reaching us from Afghanistan are very worrying. We can do more, I believe, as the EU, as the European Parliament, to give more support to you and to make your lives better. S&D will always be on your side. One might say that such meetings like this hearing are purely symbolic, yet we need to talk about it and we need to make our voice heard. As Europe, we must be the beacon of hope for women all over the world. Therefore, I would like to ask Ursula von der Leyen to continue fight for women's rights. This must be a priority of the new European Commission. Finally, I would like to turn to Afghan women. They took away your faces, they took away your voice, but they did not take away your strength and your hope. We are with you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Riedel for 1 minute.
Monsieur le Vice-président, chers
President, ladies and gentlemen, in Afghanistan, the Taliban regime is taking the hatred of women to a paroxysm. 20 million Afghans have been removed from public space in Afghanistan. They have to cover themselves completely, including their faces. This August, the Taliban adopted a new law to promote virtue and prevent vice. So this means women aren't allowed to sing or recite poetry or to wear makeup, to wear perfume, even to look at a man that isn't part of their family. This is a gender apartheid. We can talk about genocide, patriarchal attack. Women are locked up, left to themselves. There's mental health problems, there are suicides, and the country is suffering. How much do you have to hate women to prevent them from having an education, from not showing their body, without even being able to speak in public, without letting them look where they want to? Misogyny has now been taken to a superior level. The same misogyny that for thousands of years has been killing people and will continue to kill if we don't put a stop to it, regardless of the form it takes. We cannot allow the relations with the Taliban regime to be normalized. We have to have this sort of thing mentioned as a crime against humanity in international law. Let us give their voices in this hemicycle.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Now I'd give the floor to Ms. Mendez for 1 minute.
Obrigada.
Thank you very much, President. Dear colleagues, 3 years ago, the Taliban attacked Afghanistan once again and imposed rules which are inhumane, rules where women have no voice. Now, with this minute, I'd like us to remember Simone Veil as the first female president of this parliament. And with Simone Veil, we remember that we can be the silenced voice of so many women in Afghanistan. We need to do that via respect for human rights, for the work that we need to do, and also ensuring that this parliament provides asylum and welcomes these women, for all of these women, so that we can all be free. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Gori for 1 minute, please.
Grazie, signor Presidente.
Thank you, President. Well, this is my first intervention in the European Parliament, and I'm very pleased to use it to give a voice, together with the colleagues who've also spoken, to the millions of women and girls in Afghanistan, which the Taliban regime is trying to delete from social, economic and political life via inhuman laws that deprive them of the right to exist and relegates them to the role of slaves within their own homes. The Taliban regime is destroying the rights of women in Afghanistan in the almost complete silence of the international community. We cannot be party to this silence. We will not abandon Afghan women and girls to their fate. We, from this chamber, will speak out. Gender persecution and any other acts of persecution carried out against them are crimes against humanity, and we need to fight them with every tool we have available. The future of millions of Afghan women and girls depends on us as well. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Neuchel, who we can see entering right now.